excited to see all of you. My name is Lindsay. I get to be double duty today because I work at the California Academy of Sciences, and I also am one of the board members of Cultural Connections, so I get to welcome you from both entities. How many of you have been to a Cultural Connections meeting or program before? Okay, great. So we have some people who have been here, some people who haven't. Fives and twos?
Fives and twos, yeah. So fives and twos, S's is the common response. It's nothing really that hard. But apparently if you were a synesthesiac, it would look something like this, where everyone is not actually that color, but it would appear so distinct as a different color that you would not need that second you did to think about it. So that's apparently how famous mathematicians can sort through large complex equations. It's because they're synesthesiacs, and the numbers appear so distinct from each other that they just kind of pop out as if they had their own personalities. But back to kind of the sound suit we were talking about earlier, if for some reason I've sold you on one of these and you want your own, they are on sale on his website. And when I started this job about 2 years ago, they were going for about 400 euros a pop, which is only about like 500 American dollars, which is not bad for fashion or art. But recently they changed the price to like price negotiable, so I think he realized he was lowballing himself. All right. So that's an example of what we kind of do at Museum Hack, but now to like start back in the beginning of the company. So this is Nick Gray, our fearless leader in New York. So Nick did not like museums. He didn't like them at all. Until he actually went on a date at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he fell in love, but with the museum, not the date. Apparently the date went really terribly, but he liked how she talked about art in such a passionate way that he got into finding all these interesting stories in the art world that other people were not talking about. And soon the seed kind of took off. It started as like 10 things I like at the Met and 1 thing I will burn at the Met. And it grew and grew and grew until he created Museum Hack as a company, where he envisioned unhighlights tours of museums. So it's tours for people that don't necessarily want to come to a museum on a Thursday afternoon. Targeted kind of towards like millennial audiences, which haven't technically been drawn toward the art history world. I can't speak for them because I actually have a background in art history and museum studies, so who cares? But the idea was to kind of create the museum as a more social experience. And a little bit, yep, there's Casey. Hi Casey, right there. So, one of the things is, how do we actually do this job? Well, believe it or not, training to do this job is actually incredibly hard. Not only do you have to be like a museum tour guide with lots of facts, you also have to be kind of a party host because you're trying to make sure people are having a good time in the museum. And social wrangler, that's another part they don't tell you about. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to wrangle drunk adults through an art museum. It happens. But also you have to be yourself, which is a really terrible piece of advice. Like, just be yourself and everything will work out. Because that's almost impossible to teach. Like, how do you do that? If someone can tell me right now, I'll give you like $10 or something. Now, see, you'll lose. So, one of the things we also do with this job is that we're kind of making it up as we go along to a certain extent. Like all those pieces, that piece you see right there, I made that up. Like there was no formula for that, except there kind of was secretly, but that was mostly my content. And one of the things we're doing, since we've just started as a company about 2 or 3 years ago, we have the ability to like just rapidly prototype anything that works. And if it tests it out, if it gets a good response, we'll keep going with it. If it doesn't get a response, we'll chuck it and just start over. We're not actually beholden to any like institutional ideas as a company. But there are 3 things we try to do really hard. 3 things to engage a millennial audience in particular. The first is start with entertainment and passion. So as you can probably tell, while there was a good bit of information over there, I made you laugh a lot, which was kind of my main goal. Is if I can get people to laugh at me instead of just standing silent for 2 hours watching me, I know I did a good job, at least if they laughed at one of my crummy jokes. Because we found through different information that people are more likely to remember the entertainment aspect of an experience than the educational aspect. Yeah, it's true. Like, to be honest, especially with younger audiences, they kind of want that shock and awe entertainment value. We also try to make the museum a place to be social, which means like taking selfies, we have bachelorette parties at the museum. Just kind of throw it for a loop instead of just sitting quietly walking around for hours, which actually causes an unfortunate phenomenon called gallery fatigue. It's real, look it up. It's no matter how interesting museums are, you tend to get bored of them after an hour and a half because it's so dark and monotonous and you're not allowed to talk in there. So we try to keep people's energy going and their blood sugar spiked so that they can have a good time and are more willing to come away with something. The other thing we do, which kind of makes people upset, is we play games in the museum. So this can come in different forms. Either it's like going and finding a piece of art, and taking a photo of it, and coming back and making a funny story out of it, or working together with a team to do a scavenger hunt through the museum and find just quirky photos. The one I'm rather proud of, which I made, is a museum murder mystery in the 2 galleries. So I do not like colonial art whatsoever. It is just kind of okay. Like, you could, like, prove me wrong, sorry. It's an acceptable form of art, but no one looks at it. So to make people look at it, I've set up a challenge where it's, you have to go through the galleries, find a piece of art, and tell me how and why it murdered me. So no one has an issue with this game. Everyone can always play it, they come back with a quirky, fascinating story, and even if that piece of art had nothing to do with an actual murder, they looked at something they probably would have not looked at today and seen it in a different angle in a more accessible way. So there's more people interacting. So one of the things we're trying to do is create people having a more active participation in their experience. So instead of just kind of wandering around and listening to someone for an hour and a half, like we do the hands-in, blow-up thing, we tell funny stories, we ask questions throughout the tours, we make them play games, so by the end of the tour we feel like one kind of tight-knit unit, and that they feel like they had a friend. So my goal as a tour guide is not to be like the expert of anything, but your cool friend like telling you stories throughout the museum, and hopefully makes it a less intimidating place to come back to, because we believe that museums are fucking awesome, and thinks everyone should too. And that's it.
Museum of the African Diaspora. And he worked as a classroom teacher for 6 years before joining the MOAD team. And he earned his MA in Applied Anthropology. And his interest in museums began as an undergraduate student when he pursued several internships, including with MOAD, and after which he went on to the National Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2010. While working for Smithsonian, he formed his idea for his master's thesis on reframing learning in museums, based on a film workshop there, and he's explored the use of cell phones and handheld technology in classrooms and museums. Today, we're super excited to have you join us.
It's like my whole bio.
Yes, your whole thing. Everyone knows everything about you.
So I've worked at several museums, including this museum, for a brief period of time. I've worked at almost every museum in the Bay Area except for the Asian Art Museum, and I worked at SF MoMA for like a couple of days. So. That's another story altogether. So yeah, I wanted to talk about making tours age appropriate for your audience. So in MOAD we have a very small education department. I'm half of the education department. It's myself and my supervisor. So I do a lot of the tours myself. In fact, I did 2 tours today. So I have a lack of docents, especially that are available during the week when we have school groups. So I end up leading like 50% of the tours myself. So it's fine. I was a classroom teacher. I know how to discipline kids and I know how to keep kids quiet. So it works out pretty well usually. But what has to happen is you have to find the appropriate level for your audience. We have lots of elementary school kids that come in. We have middle school, we have high school kids, college kids, and children of different ages understand things differently. And one of the things that I wanted to add to my talk is discussing challenging topics. Because we're the only museum in the Bay Area that focuses on Black art, we're sometimes looked at as a museum only for a Black audience, which is not the case. But come February, when everybody wants to be participating in Black History Month, we get overwhelmed where we have to turn people away for tours because we can't post that many tours in 1 week. So the first thing you have to do is ask yourself who your audience is, right? So what's the age group of the kids you're talking to? Where are they visiting from? That'll have a big influence on what they know and their cultural perspective, right? If I have kids from a school in East Oakland, they're going to have a different perspective than kids from San Ramon or Castro Valley, where I grew up, right? So then you have to ask the question, why aren't they at the museum? To learn or simply to look? So that depends on the context of your museum. I think if you're coming to the California Academy of Sciences, it's a science museum, so you're here to learn about science, right? So maybe if you're going to the De Young or if you're going to another art museum, you're just there to like enjoy the art, and that's fine too. That's totally okay to go to a museum for the aesthetic purpose of the museum. What's the educational outcome expected? So that's something that I think as a museum guide, it's helpful to ask the educator beforehand. So if you reach out to the teacher that's going to bring their class in and say, what are you guys studying right now in school? How do you want this to tie into what you're studying in your curriculum? So that really helps inform how you lead the tour when you know what the teacher expects from you. So understanding your audience is what they understand. So looking at their attention span. So when you have like eager small kids, they're going to have lots of questions. They're going to be more engaged sometimes. And when you have teenagers, they're going to probably be more concerned about social media than what's going on in front of them. And I've had this. It's helpful, I think, if you tell kids they can't use their phones, but then they want to start taking pictures. So then their phones are out. And once their phones are out, then they're on Snapchat or whatever else they use, right? So you have to kind of start off, at least in my experience, when you have kids with phones, you start off without allowing them to use their phones until later in the tour. Otherwise, you kind of lose the audience. When I was teaching high school, I couldn't really keep my students off of their phones, right? I was supposed to be a cell phone free thing in the classroom, but it was impossible to monitor. So I just got to the point where I would just, I would just let it go and just take away participation points for them using their phones. But when you're in a museum, you're talking about an informal area, so you don't want to make it too stuffy, and you want the kids to have fun. So sometimes you want them to take selfies and stuff like that Julian was talking about. You want them to, include that in their tour experience. But if you're trying to educate them, I'm strictly a museum educator, so I'm trying to inform the children about what the content of our museum is. So you have to find a balance between the use of technology and not using it too much. So that's important as well. These are just tools that we have on our website when you book tours that help us to figure out who the audience is. So when a teacher comes to our website to book a tour, they have to go through this thing and they say what grade or kind of group they have. So that gives me some indication of the age. And then we also add these questions recently. What are your learning goals for your visit? How does it connect to your curriculum? So that's another thing that helps us. And then we ask about special needs because that could be help us redesign the tour. And then additional information. So these are just things that when I get this feedback from a teacher, if they follow through, and a lot of teachers don't, they'll just put the grade and then they'll leave all those parts blank, which is pretty frequent. But if they follow through, they help me design the tour better for their group, right, for their specific group. Also, very important, and I don't know where all of you work, and this might not be something that comes up, but this is one of the most important things happening right now. As Lindsay mentioned earlier, there's a lack of diversity of museum attendees, right? But if you look around in public schools in the Bay Area, the majority of students are children of color, right? So you have to address this at some point. I mean, maybe if you work in a certain type of museum, it doesn't come up as an issue, but in my museum, every day this is something to talk about. Talking about race is important. So how do you talk about race? You need to speak from your own experiences with race and racism, regardless of your ethnic background. You have to be comfortable talking about it. Students will pick up on stuff, right? I was at a symposium at De Young recently, and they were talking about how to talk about race in museums. And some of the docents there, I've even worked with some in the past, they're really great people, but they kept saying how uncomfortable they were talking about race. So how can you, if you're uncomfortable, the kids are going to perceive that, right? They're going to see that you're uncomfortable and you're going to make them feel awkward. So you have to kind of get over yourself, get over your white privilege, and be able to talk about race with kids of color, right? It's a very important thing. Be conscious and curious about the way race is important to your students' lives. You're going to end up with students from all different backgrounds. So you have to think about how their ethnicity affects them, why they feel uncomfortable and unwelcome in museums, why they feel like it's not a space for them to go to. You have to dispel ideas of biological race. I think most of the people in this room, I'm sure, understand that, but today I had a group of students and one of them asked me, there were 7th grade kids from Oakland, and the kids said, well, how come if everyone's from Africa originally, how come we have different skin colors, right? So I had to go through this conversation about biologically there's no different races and stuff. But also you have to figure out if the audience can understand that. Like if I had 3rd graders, I would explain it in a little bit of a simpler way. If I have older kids, I would go more into detail about it. I think I used the term social construct today. These 7th graders were like, what does that mean? So I had to back it up and make it a little bit easier to understand. Then also reacquaint yourself with the evolving social constructions surrounding race, how it's used throughout history, so that I just mentioned basically. And then avoid colorblind language. If you acknowledge who you are, and you're comfortable with yourself, it doesn't matter if your ethnicity, as long as you acknowledge that and let the kids know that you're aware of your own position, right? So I think that's very important for people, that educators that are dealing with children of color too. find a way to talk about this. Because again, like I said, if you're uncomfortable talking about these subjects and you avoid them, then the kids are going to pick up on that, I think. Another thing to do is resist telling a simple story. So avoid presenting sanitized accounts that obscure the realities of racial violence and systems of racial control. These are things that are happening, right, around us all the time. One of the reasons I left teaching was because I was teaching in Pacifica. Anybody familiar with Pacifica, California? So I basically I wasn't blacklisted, but the fact that I was teaching my history students about social justice was unacceptable for the administration of this school. And so I decided it wasn't a place I felt comfortable teaching. So I decided to go back into museums, which I'm much happier doing. But it's important not to, kids are smarter than we give them credit for, right? And so if you think they don't pick up on what's going on, they're on their phones all the time, they're using social media, and they're seeing the news and stuff. And these kids know a lot more than we give them credit for. So we can't try to soften things necessarily. I mean, you have to, if the kids are younger, you have to find ways to communicate to children that is appropriate for their age level. But as the kids get older, you're going to have to be more real about stuff. Address work that remains to be done in current day inequalities and challenges to race justice. So this is not necessarily something that happens all the time with certain types of museums, but it can come into the conversation when kids ask about, why do you guys focus on this collection? I had a group of students at another museum for a tour, and one of the students asked, how come there's no people of color in this exhibition? Was there no people of color in the Bay Area at this time? And these 6 African American students I had, they kind of thought it was weird. They're like, wasn't there any black people in the Bay Area in the 60s? There was a few, right? Obviously, so they weren't included in the conversation, right? You have to also shift students thinking away from individuals towards systems and institutions. So, I mean, this is kind of like, this idea is like, showing children that the systems in play kind of have an influence on our lives and affect the things they do. Present history from a global perspective that captures the international implications. So by this I mean, this is a problem that happens all over the world. This is something that happens in different places, right? And so if you can get kids to understand that the things that happen, they experience in the United States and the Bay Area, are also happening in other parts of the country, in other countries, I think they feel connected more to other people, right, of different cultures. So I think I'm just going to show you guys what I'm doing right now. We have a carnival exhibition, so this is how I present a tour. I'm just going to demo how I do a tour for you guys. So I get a group of kids and I ask them if they know what carnival is about. Like, where's carnival from? What's the origins of it? Why is it spread throughout the world? And then which countries are best known for it? So you have to go back historically, and I take it back to kind of the origins and show them that it started in Europe, right? So we talk about masquerade in Venice, and just to give them the historical background of it and show them that it's something that was imported along with other traditions from Europe. Then we just kind of jump to Brazil, where it's well known for the biggest celebration in the world of Carnival. And this is kind of cool. I haven't had to see these slides this big before. I usually have on a tiny iPad. So it looks a lot different when I'm setting. So we talk about how it's in Brazil. And this is a chance for me to dispel ideas kids have about slavery, about where people were taken. When I ask a group of elementary school kids where the majority of slaves were brought to, they always say the United States, right? It doesn't matter where they go to school. They go, I give them, hey, give me a percentage of how many people were brought to the United States as slaves. And they usually say 90% or say. And so these kids they're not getting taught this information in school, so it's a chance to correct some of the wrong information they got. We start talking about Brazil and how the Caribbean is celebrated throughout the Caribbean. I think I made this list. They don't expect the kids to read it, but I put every country that I could find that celebrates Carnival, and just to show them the number of countries and the magnitude of places that celebrate it. So it gives these kids an idea that it's something that happens in different countries that speak different languages in different parts of the Western Hemisphere. And also back in Europe too, right? Places that have large Caribbean populations. And then what I have been doing is, since the artists can't be with us in the gallery, I want to show the kids who the artists are. So they get an idea of how these people look and the diversity of these people. One of the students today, I showed this picture of this Jamaican artist, and they're like, oh, that guy's Jamaican? And I guess he expected him to look like Bob Marley or something. But it's a way for me to connect the kids to the artist and show them who the artist is. So this is basically the slideshow that I do with my students as I'm walking through the gallery. I'll talk about this guy's art. This is a little bit more about his art, which I won't go into detail about, but this other Jamaican artist, you know about that one? This other Jamaican artist, Ebony Patterson, I showed that, so our show right now is performance art, but I want to show examples of their other art. So I show this to the students, I talk about how they, what kind of art they do aside from performance art. This is part of the Ebony Patterson thing. And then I started putting flags in between as a marker, like, okay, these two artists are from Jamaica. Next artist from the Bahamas, and talk about his art. And then there's the Bahamian flag there. So this is how I kind of set up the tour, and as I go through, I can stop, I can pause, I can answer more questions by the kids. I always ask them questions about, like, using visual teaching strategies about color, and we're talking about the color of the art, not the color of the people, right? So we talk about color, we talk about images and shapes and stuff like that, and basically, this is just my slideshow from my current exhibition, so I'll just read through it real quick. This guy's French, so I put the French flag in there. This guy is from Trinidad, yeah. British artist, and so on and so forth. There's a couple more. But for the most part, this is just kind of the way we approach giving tours in Moab. And again, dealing with race might not be something that all of you have to deal with in the content of your museums, but you have to think about your audience regardless of whether or not you're talking about subject matter or art that has to do with race. Your audience is going to be diverse in the Bay Area, so you have to think about your audience and not look at everything from one perspective. You have to make it accessible to all the children that come through your museum. They'll have a better experience. Hopefully that will change the statistics of who comes through museums and what kind of audiences we build. That's about it.
Born and raised, and she has nearly 10 years of experience as an educator working with K-12 students in art, health, and social justice. In 2012, Tina graduated from UC Santa Cruz with 2 BAs in psychology and art history, and she's currently working on her certificate for graphic design at CCSF. When she's not working, she has other hobbies. Traveling, sports, maybe, Julian, you could ask her what sports ball is. Art, and dancing. Thanks for joining us, Tina.
Thank you. Alright, so hello everyone. All of y'all got a brief introduction of myself. Of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg and not the full thing. But yeah, I'm here to talk about some of the tour strategies we use in the education department at the D. Young Museum. So I'll just slide through. Oh, I did it.
I did the magic one.
Cool. Alright, so to kind of explain what I do at the D Young, I made this little flow chart, and I'm actually going to post it on my LinkedIn because I was like, this is the best way to explain it. So yeah, so I work at the D Young in the education department, and I got blessed with like 2 roles. So on the left, I coordinate team programs. I coordinate the Museum Ambassador Program, which is a long-standing program. It's been around for like over 25 years. And I hire and train teams to go out into the community and in the museum to work with families to do art projects. Also under that side of the umbrella, I coordinate Teen Advisory Board, which is new, but we hire teens from around San Francisco to host, develop, and basically just come up with their own teen event for the D. Young Museum. And that's happening in March. So if you want to know more information about that, holla at your girl. And so on the other side of that branch, we have Outreach Coordinator for Revelations, which is our special exhibition, Revelations from the Art from the African American South. And in that special project, I do a lot of program promotion, and also I work with community representatives, which are different people from around the Bay Area, different volunteers that come in and just say like, hey, I am super interested in this topic and I want to help out any way I can. So yeah, and they are usually in the gallery. So Teen Advisory Board and community representatives are both highlighted in pink because that's where I participate in tour strategies. So what we use in our department, we use inquiry-based tour style, and so we use visual thinking strategies. How many of y'all, just from a show of hands, have heard of this? Okay, cool. That's like over half. That's fantastic. So for those of you that don't know, visual thinking strategies was a collaboration between the director of education at New York MoMA and another cognitive psychologist at Yale. And pretty much they came together to be like, hey, how do we know people are actually learning and taking away information from what they learned at the museum? Because when we asked them a week later, they're like, Yeah, I don't remember any of that. So they came together and was just like, let's come up with a way to facilitate an art conversation, a fulfilling conversation without someone lecturing them the whole time. So I'm gonna do a demo of a visual thinking strategy, and the piece I'm gonna show you I actually used in a diversity and inclusion training in the education department. Yeah. So first, I want to thank you all for joining me for this visual thinking strategy session. And what we're going to do right now, I want you all to take a good 30 to 45 seconds to look closely at this piece. You can feel free to come up closer, feel free to move back, but begin to just study the details in the image. All right, so what do we see going on in this image?
A woman being bathed by another woman.
All right, so you see a woman being bathed. What more can we find?
Arabic writing.
Oh, can you say that one more time?
Arabic writing on the wall.
All right, so you see Arabic writing on the wall. What do you see that makes you say it's Arabic writing?
Arabic characters.
All right, so you recognize those characters as Arabic from your past and previous experiences.
Right. I'm not sure if they're real or not, but yeah.
Cool. What do you guys notice about the people in this image?
It's a very stark contrast between the skin colors of the two people, and the person doing the bathing is, you know, has like different jewelry. I think that's a necklace and earrings and a headpiece.
Oh, okay. All right, so you're noticing that between the two people in the image that there's a lot of contrast. So you see someone that's sitting down with their back turned and they're white, and in contrast you see a black woman standing up and she has a lot of jewelry and accessories on. What more can we find about these two folks? Or that tell us about their relationship?
They shine from the left upper corner.
They shine from
The light coming in.
All right, so you're noticing how the light hits these two women. What more can we find with their relationship?
Their postures tell a lot about their power dynamics. She's kind of in like a very comfortable pose being bathed, while the other person's looks like they're doing hard at work, while she's kind of lax and more vulnerable looking.
Okay, so you're noticing that someone in this, or this woman sitting down here is more relaxed. Her body looks a lot more calm and, you know, like she's enjoying herself, whereas the woman standing up is doing the labor. Right. And then I saw your hand.
I was going to say the same thing. I sense that just by how she's supporting her wrist, and the other woman is very relaxed. And, yeah.
So you're adding on to that, to Julian's comment and observation about how one person is doing the labor and another person is having leisure. Woman with the glasses in the back. You.
Okay, that's me. They're also not looking at each other. The white woman's looking down and away, and the other woman's looking like across the room.
Yeah.
They're not engaged, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so they're not meeting in a psychic line. One person, the woman standing up doing the bathing or the washing, is looking at the woman, and then the woman sitting down is just looking away. What do you all think? Who do you think made this painting, based on what you see in this image?
Like what kind of a person or the artist?
Yeah, who?
Probably a white man.
What do you see that makes you say it could be a white man?
The dynamic between the two women.
Okay.
It's probably kind of like a fantasy, I guess, of what you think like a bathhouse could be like. Yeah.
Okay. And so, can you tell me your name?
Romanticizing it a little.
Can you tell me your name?
Oh, Kate.
Kate. All right. So, Kate, you mentioned that you believe this is a white man making this image because the fact that these are kind of this is a harem actually, and it's a bathhouse. So it's a place that men could not go, and so this is his idea of fantasy of what the interactions in that space are like. Yeah. What more can we find or say about?
The white woman in the center is very well lit. Her body is almost glowing, while the woman who's working on her, the black woman, is in shadow, even with her face as well, even though both their faces are shadowed. But it's also really interesting how they're touching, how both their hands are touching. There's a level of comfort and ease, and it's almost, it's like how a dancer holds their hand or arm, which doesn't make it seem realistic, which again makes it seem like it's a fantasy and not reality. Even though there could be that amount of trust between the two, it's still fantasy as opposed to reality.
Yeah, so you're noticing that the interaction between these two women have somewhat of a fantasy feel to it. Not only with just the tones and the image, how this woman in the center is, you know, the brightest, but yet both faces are shadowed, but just even how they're touching and interacting with each other, there's a softness, there's a comfortability, even though it could be taboo. All right, so that is my BTS session. And yeah, now I want to ask you all, what did you notice about the facilitation?
You were actively listening.
All right, so I actively listened to what everyone had to say. Yes?
You repeated back or mirrored to make sure you were saying it correctly, or you kind of repeating back what the person said?
Yeah, so I wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying, so I paraphrased.
You never really said anyone was wrong.
Yeah, so I kept all of my responses neutral. I didn't say like, you said that you did great, or like, that's okay. Yes?
You were using a lot of hand motions to reinforce what the person was commenting on.
Yeah, so I gestured at different parts of the image depending on what that person was describing.
And you didn't try to influence somebody's perspective of the image. You just kind of, you were trying to encourage them to, you know, see the image in their, you know, perspective.
Yeah, so by staying neutral, I wanted to make sure I let the person who had the stage or was speaking have that time to, you know, feel like, you know, their thoughts were validated and also that they were heard. Oh, and then one more.
I was gonna say you were asking guiding questions to sort of move us.
Yeah, so I had certain questions set up to keep the conversation flowing, and then I saw your hand in the back.
That's what I was going to say. You weren't telling us anything. It was explorative, and we were creating the content.
Yeah, so all in response, the whole conversation came from you all. I just helped you guys link up different ideas and thoughts. So, visual thinking strategies is an inquiry-based strategy, and so it's really guided by 3 central questions. So what's going on in this image? Just a broad question, just to be like, what do you see? Tell me, that's it. You don't need to have any historical context, just tell me what do you see. And then after that, we ask, what do you see that makes you say that? So we want to make sure that person justifies what they're saying. So, you know, and what do we see going on in this image? You might have like a young child just say like, I see lots of blue. It doesn't make sense to say, what do you see that makes you say that? Because that's, yeah, it's like, yeah, it's blue because it's blue. But if someone shares their opinion, that's really, you want to follow up with that question, what do you see that makes you say that? So then you can get the idea or their perspective of where they're coming from. Especially when I started asking about who do you think made that image, you start hearing more about like, well, I think it could be a white man. It's like, well, what do you see that makes you say that? And then that person was able to elaborate on that. And then third, we want to open back up that conversation and keep the conversation flowing by asking what more can we find. And it's very important that we say more instead of else, because when we say else, it's kind of a way to like when you think about a teacher or when they say like, oh, what else, they're kind of looking for a certain response. Whereas when you say, what more can we find, it's just kind of like, anything, just tell me, what's on your mind? And also, I mean, this might be just like childhood, small trauma, but like when your mom says like, what else? It's like, say nothing. Okay. So we use visual thinking strategies all throughout the education department, and particularly in my programs with Teen Advisory Board, which plans a large teen event for the museum, and also with community representatives that work in the Revelations galleries. We have conversation stations, and pretty much that means that we have a volunteer kind of like stay in a certain gallery, and they help facilitate those conversations. So this is especially important for cultural exhibitions, especially like Revelations, art from the African American South, because it's a very heavy content. We talk about Jim Crow South, we're talking about lynching, we're talking about domestic terrorism. Like, that is a lot for people to take in, and for some people that's like a rude awakening. So it's great to have that person there to just kind of be like, all right, let me help you download this. So for participants, what they get out of, or what we kind of notice, is that it fosters open discussion. Participants are able to share their perspectives and justify their opinion. They see that their knowledge and perspective is valued and recognized. It improves their visual literacy and social skills. And also, it doesn't feel like school, which is part of the reason why we started the conversation station when it came to planning our first teen event, Teens Take Action, because they're like, yeah, I don't want to have all these materials by me because it feels like a field trip, and they're coming here for fun, not for, to be told what to do by a teacher. And there's also benefits for the facilitator. So it empowers the facilitator in their learning. So with Revelations, the community reps are, we just told them like, hey, we want you to write 2 conversation stations for 2 pieces that really resonate with you. So, just because I think one piece is really great, you might find a lot of inspiration and really be able to explore and explain a piece better than anyone else because you love that piece. So it empowers them in their learning. It also creates a supportive team during coaching and practice. So when we do practice things before we, use them with the public, especially with like Revelations and here with our teen programs. With the Revelations, because everyone got to choose their own piece, like everyone was fully engaged in practice because it was a lot of information they didn't know, or maybe they were just like, I saw this piece, but I don't really like it, so I'm gonna walk past it. But someone else in that cohort was like, oh, I'm so, I love this piece, let me do it. So, you were able to like kind of see, how discovery happens and exploration. Everyone was able to support each other. It also improves active listening skills, so I had to be a mediator and make sure I was able to link some of the comments and remember what people said. And also improves public speaking and social skills. So we all kind of talk about how teens are always on their phones and stuff, which they are. And so things like this, conversation stations and stuff, help them kind of get away from the phone and realize like, there's people in front of you. We have to have empathy. We have to be able to talk to the folks around us, because if someone shuts off the electricity, what you gonna do? Right, so that is my conversation station.
Years. She's been doing work in the field of blindness for over 10 years, and she's also been a Peace Corps volunteer. She's done all sorts of amazing things, and amazing things. I think they're amazing. When she's not rolling out social and recreational programs for the community, she's busy nesting in her new home and cooking, eating delicious food, and spending quality time with her spouse and friends.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today, Serena.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. I'm actually also kind of excited that I'm last, because I'm going to break your presentation flow by not having a fancy PowerPoint. As you can imagine, as a blind person, this is part of a presentation that generally doesn't engage me a whole lot. But if you're following the #1 rule of PowerPoints, you're not just reading off of your slides, right? Your slides are minimal, and I enjoyed every one of the previous presentations and got quite a bit from them, so you passed the test. So my goal here, so let me back up. My mission is to get us thinking differently about things that we think we know. And by doing that, I want to cover like 3 general topic areas. 1, what does a blind person know about museums? 2, some general guidelines when thinking about disability. So, and 3, maybe a little bit of homework if you so choose to follow through on it. So my job here is to bring us to the intersection of museums and disability, or blindness specifically, because that's the one that I know a thing or two about. I do not claim to be an expert on pan-disability issues. So 1, what does a blind person know about museums? Many moons ago, when I was a young college student, I'm not a young college student anymore, I started taking some anthropology modules at my community college in Santa Barbara. And I started discovering all these great modules on Asia. And I discovered that I was a complete Asia freak, and I wanted to learn everything that I could about Asia, and I wanted to go there, and I wanted to travel around the world. You know, I've studied Japanese, I've studied Chinese, I've studied Korean, I picked up quite a bit of Indonesian while I was there, I learned a little bit of Vietnamese when I was there. You know, so over the years, you know, my passion for Asia grew and grew, and I have been fortunate to do a lot of traveling and whatnot. I moved up to the Bay Area in 2010 and discovered this great resource, the Asian Art Museum. Have you been there? Some of you, I think, have been there? Yeah. So it's like the world's, it's the biggest collection of Asian art, probably west of the Mississippi or in the entire country or something really fabulous like that. I moved up here, I was job hunting, and I thought, what better way to stay busy than to volunteer? And I came to volunteer for the Asian Art Museum for about 2 years, actually, like well into the time that I started working. It was monthly, I was not there all the time, but over the course of 2.5 years, prior to joining the Peace Corps, I was there every month. I worked at the information desk in the coat check room, and I did the whole day. I chose to do my 2 shifts back to back so that I could wander around the museum on my lunch hour. And I did a lot of socio-political stuff in college, and I never really delved into the world of arts as much, so it was a great educational opportunity for me, and it was great to just, spend a Sunday afternoon wandering around the Asian. it was a really, and, reduced price memberships and discounts in the gift store didn't, hurt either. And so I found all these ways to enjoy the museum, even, as a blind person, and I think this is my deepest and most meaningful relationship to a museum is this experience that I had with the Asian art. And not just because of the museum itself, but also because a snarky blind friend of mine, when I was going on one day about how great it was and how much I loved it, he, snarkily replied, well, I'm not into museums, I don't want to go look at things I can't see, you know what I mean? Always the critic, he's one of my best friends. And it got me thinking, well, I can see enough to get into trouble, but not enough to get out is how I generally explain it to people. I do have some useful vision. So I got to thinking, well, what is it that I enjoy so much, right? There are aspects to the museum. There are the audio tours, which are super informative. There are various video stations around the museum where I can pop on some headphones and listen to a documentary. They do a lot of performance. They do interactive stuff. If you don't mind hanging out with little kids, you can make art. They have yoga once a month, right? I tried that out a couple times. So it was a complete joy to me, and I got quite a bit out of my time there. But Sean's question always nagged at me. I don't want to look at things I can't see. So wow, so maybe blind people aren't going out to museums. My second encounter significantly with a museum was I had the opportunity around that same time period to consult with the SF MoMA. They were doing a docent training, and I got to go give feedback on the docent tours. And significantly, the lesson that is learned there is that, first of all, docents have to have a master's degree to do what they do, and this is a volunteer job. All respect to them. So I got to talk to them. The main takeaway there for me was this is about spatial awareness, right? When I ask where are the restrooms and you say over there is a really big place. So thinking about things in terms of spatial relations, like, oh, put the information counter on your right and they're straight ahead, or, you know, just past the elevators or some other notable landmark. Thinking relationally, and then also descriptively, being very descriptive about things, and also sort of giving a little description and then maybe asking a suggestive question. So instead of, what do we notice here? The Jeopardy theme song is playing in my head while I wait. You know, saying, you know, there's a toad sitting on a mushroom. What do you think motivated the artist to do that? You know, that always can be helpful as well, for sure. But then there's, you know, having Braille signage throughout the museum, things like that. There's like common accessibility stuff that you don't really need to hear from me necessarily. But so just that idea of being descriptive about how you talk and potentially like not asking heavily visual questions, but rather like giving a description of something and then asking a thoughtful question about that. Is a small way, like from the docent perspective, that you can enhance the quality of a tour, for sure. Most recently, my third connection to the museum world, I work at the Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired in San Francisco over by Civic Center. We have a beautiful building. Please come by. We have an information concierge that gives tours. The National Park Service recently reached out to us to collaborate with them on, I hear that accessibility is flagging within the National Park Service. So they've decided, they've embarked on a project. I think they have like 5 categories of sites. One of which is apparently boats. And they're going to take, they're starting with the Balclutha, which is up in the marina. Oh, yay! In the house! So the visitor center and some of the space on the pier leading up to the Balclutha, and then the Balclutha significantly, they're working at, they're using universal design principles, which is like not just about disability necessarily, but like all kinds of different ways to enjoy the museum experience, right? So we got to do some consulting, and they brought in 4 different exhibits, like mock-ups. They're not in their finished form, but they let us take a look at them, and then we gave them feedback about like, well, I find this interesting, or this was confusing, or I really like that. And so being able to collaborate with the National Park Service, because the idea is that they're going to make this the flagship, no pun intended, right? They're going to make this the model, the standard for accessible design, and ideally, if they get the grant funding, they're going to deploy this throughout the National Park Service and enhance the experience for everybody, right? So that's my connection to the world of museums significantly. So I would go to sort of guidelines when you're thinking about accessibility and disability. I hate to break it to you, but there is no one-size-fits-all. I know you're probably expecting that. And that is based on the principle that blind people are a cross-section of society. I mean, disabled people in general are as well, right? Like every size, color, shape, inclination. Blindness is just a characteristic that we happen to have. So for every blind person who wants an accommodation, you're probably going to get a different idea of what accommodation means. And the ADA is vague about that. So keep in mind, 1, that blindness is a characteristic, and there's not going to be one-size-fits-all solution for everyone. 2, I would ask you to please just ask how. Don't ask if, ask how. The disabled person who's requesting some kind of accommodation, they might not have the answer, but if you ask them how, instead of making it a binary yes or no question, then maybe that'll provoke them to think about it. You know, rather than shutting down the conversation with 50% of if is no. So blindness is a characteristic. Don't ask if, ask how. And finally, high expectations. People live up to the expectations that you set for them almost entirely. Anyone who works with teenagers might know that for sure, right? And sadly, among the disability community, and I can speak from the blindness perspective for sure, expectations are often like painfully low. You know, I'm on BART during commute hour, like staring at my smartphone because that's what my muscle memory has learned over the years, but I'm using voice over technology, and everyone wants to know if I want to sit down. My legs aren't broken. You know, my eyes don't work very well, but if I get on a crowded BART train, I don't mind standing with all the other commuters. But that's not the expectation that people have, right? And that's just one example. You know, if I'm waiting to cross the street to go to my full-time salaried job during the commute rush, and people are like, you can cross the street. And I'm like, thanks. Yes, the parallel traffic is surging. So it's like, you know, my experience moving through the world is not less, it's different. And that's something that people don't often consider. So thinking differently about what we think we know is really important, right? Homework. This is the fun part. I have two examples of something that I've encountered recently that I think are really fun and fabulous examples of thinking differently about something. One is a couple, a duo, who goes by the name of Lowland Hum. Has anyone heard of them? We got a couple yeahs out there? By the way, if you're raising your hand, it's completely lost on me, so feel free to say yeah. So Lowland Hum is a really adorable couple. I get the impression that they live in a van for a big part of the year and just drive around and play small venues. He plays guitar, she sometimes plays, she has a little standing snare drum and a bag full of like little shakers and noisemakers and stuff. And the music is very beautiful and it's very sort of ethereal and sweet. And they're working at making what is overwhelmingly an audio experience into a more multimodal experience. They've printed lyric books to pass out at concerts because she says, you know, I like to follow along in the little CD booklets, you know, when I get a new CD. You know, and I think some people just enjoy that visual experience, and so we pass out little lyric books for people who want to follow along while we perform. So, right, so they're bringing the visual component in kind of a different medium. They have literally like stopped at a bakery in a new town and bought bread and broken bread and shared bread while they were performing to kind of create this community experience. They also got feedback that people thought they were trying to force communion on them, which is unfortunate. No, it's not communion, we're breaking bread. And then the reason that I'm significantly aware of these folks is because they've experimented with using sleeve shades, right? Like they heard about this dining in the dark experience and they thought, what if we did this at one of our shows? I have very critical things to say about the dining in the dark experience, which I could share with you offline. But this is another way that they're thinking differently about what's an audio format and how do we get people to experience it differently? How do we like, you know, focus it on the ears or take it out of the ears and put it in their hands or something, right? So they're really working on that multimodal experience. And then secondly, sort of a different end of the spectrum, I guess, a local choreographer and dancer, Jess Curtis. Does anyone happen to know Gravity Productions and Jess Curtis? Yeah, starving artists. He's a choreographer and a dancer, and he's been doing some really interesting experimentation with taking what is traditionally a visual format and making it accessible in more multimodal ways, like particularly to the blind community, right? Like, how do I go enjoy a dance performance? How do I go enjoy a museum? So he's incorporated, so the dancers will sometimes describe what they're doing, but it doesn't feel like cheesy accessibility overlay. It feels like performance art, right? Like it's built into the performance. So there's that aspect. He also has worked in audio description, so when I come in, I can request a headset and put it on, and I get a narrator telling me about some of the visual stuff that's not obvious, right? This is also available in many theaters. So you get the audio description, and interestingly, this is where it kind of really dovetails nicely, is he's really working at trying to create a performance space. So he'll also sometimes have chairs in the performance space, so the dancers will perform all around you. He actually described it to me recently as like, I want it to be kind of like a museum experience, you know? He wants to encourage people from the audience to actually come up to the dancers and like come in close and stare at them and like look at them from different angles as though they were looking at a museum piece, right? That part he's having a harder time with, right? Because I think there's that divide where you're like, they're doing their thing and that's their space and they're just an observer. But he's really thinking like, how can I pull people in and make this more interactive? So, Lowland Hum, they did an NPR Tiny Desk concert. That would probably be the easiest thing to find. And Jess Curtis actually has a show running from tonight. Today's the 2nd, right? Yeah. The 2nd through the 5th at the Joe Good Annex, which is 401 Alabama Street. If you're interested in checking out the show, the cheap tickets are $20. It's up this direction, right? I don't know where the state streets are, because I live in the East Bay. Potrero Hill area, okay. So you actually, if you really want to follow through, like I would really recommend dropping in and checking it out. It's actually happening this weekend. And you can connect with Jess, he's very earthy and approachable, and talk to him about this sort of multimodal approach to something that is just traditionally visual, which museums overwhelmingly are. And with that, I leave you to your homework.